everyone, welcome to episode 11 of Biz Talk with Emmanuel. Today, my guest came all the way from Switzerland. He is Greg Bernarda, the co-author of a well-known strategy book called Value Proposition Design, and is part of the Strategyzer community with Alexander Osterwalder and Yves Bigner and the others. I've recently had the privilege to sit at his 2 days masterclass in Melbourne, and boy, what an experience! I've been using the business model and value proposition canvas at some level with clients, but to be able to do the masterclass and share experience with fellow facilitators is just another level. Well, let's not keep him waiting. Let's listen into my interview with Greg Bernarda, the co-author of the book Value Proposition Design from Strategyzer. Hi Greg, thank you for being in the podcast and welcome to this podcast.
Thanks for having me, Emmanuel. Good to be here.
Now, the audience has heard my introduction, so how about you tell us a little bit more about what I haven't already mentioned during the introduction?
Yes, so I'm a co-author of this book called Value Proposition Design, and I spend my time with organizations of all kinds to help them with their innovation process. And background is I worked for about 10 years at the World Economic Forum, got really interested in this idea of collaborative innovation, and I spend most of my time designing and facilitating groups of people to come together to invent their future, reinvent what they're doing.
Impressive. So how did you become part of Strategyzer?
I started to, in this whole journey of innovation, I started to be interested in this whole space of design thinking. The whole idea of drawing inspiration from the design professions like designers, architects, and so on. And, Strategyzer had started to work with came up with this business model canvas, which is a design tool to design not only products and services, but entire business models. So I love the idea of applying this design thinking lens to the whole system of how an organization creates, delivers, and captures value. And on the personal side, Alex Osterwalder, who's the lead author, creator of the business model canvas, is a friend of mine. We went to university together, so we got back at some point and started doing projects together.
So tell us a little bit more about design thinking. You mentioned about business model using design thinking. How do people usually do business model if it wasn't in the space of design thinking?
Yeah, so business model, before this canvas, I think a business model meant different things to different people. There wasn't really a common definition, and there wasn't really a common picture or symbol of what that business model is. And so what we were observing before was that people were having all sorts of conversations. But one person would talk about a feature of a product, another person would talk about the growth of the company, another product would talk about values and philosophy. And all of these are really interesting conversations to have, but maybe not all at the same time. So what this business model canvas did is put a visual to a conversation and allow to create a common language inside organizations so that we can have very focused conversation on how we create, reinvent, redesign business models.
Cool. So tell us how the canvas come about, because I understand people don't just pop out, let's do these lines and do this kind of canvas. Tell us about the process, how you come about ending up with that canvas that we know now as the business model canvas.
Yeah, so it's a brainchild of Alex, who invented this canvas. He actually did his PhD thesis on the canvas, and that was the what came out of his PhD thesis. So it was something very practical, but backed by a lot of research from his hand. So I think what he's done is draw from all sorts of different approaches, the old tools of, SWOT analysis, 4 to 5 forces, all of these things, but merged all of this with this emerging practice of design thinking, and basically came out with a visual tool that brings together the 9 most essential things you have to think about when you talk about business models, when you talk about what you need in terms of your infrastructure, your resources to create value, how you're going to approach customers, what value you're going to create for them, and ultimately how you're going to capture some of that value for yourself as an organization, be profitable or at least sustainable if you're a not-for-profit or in the world of academia, government.
Yeah, so that's interesting because what I come across when I started using Strategyzer for my clients is the business model canvas doesn't just attack from how you attract the market or how you operate the business, which in my background when I deal with clients, generally my clients come from two sort of people people that want me to help them with their operation, or people that wants me to help them with getting their footing in the market space. Mm-hmm. But business model canvas approach is very different. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so the whole idea is that today, if innovation is a big topic for any organization nowadays, because we understand the world is moving very fast, we need to constantly reinvent ourselves. And so when we talk about innovation, it's not just about tech innovation, it's not just about process, culture, or product innovation, but it's really about having a 360 view of innovation. And so what the business model does is that it hits on all of the different parts of an organization that have something to do with innovation. And so if you will, to make it more simple, what we need to think about when we think about innovation is we need to think about how we're creating value in new ways for customers, but also how we're organizing ourselves inside our organization to do things differently and innovate at that level. So it's innovating in the front end of the shop as well as in the back end of the shop. And so we have this model that we used, actually a model borrowed from IDEO, the design thinking agency, which says that in order to have a successful business, you have to have three things. You have to have desirability. Your customers have to want your product or your service. It has to be feasible. In other words, we have to be able to organize ourselves, have the right resources to make it happen. And the business has to be viable. In other words, you need to bring in more revenues than you have costs. And those are the three areas that you see mapped nicely on this business model canvas. Those of you who are at home can take a look. Front end is about desirability, back end is about feasibility, and the bottom part is all about revenues minus cost viability. You need all three to have a successful business model.
So let's talk about the first one, desirability. Now it's easy to, particularly in a B2C environment where you create a product just to appeal to a customer. Luxury products is a good type. So when we talk about desirability, in this case, are we just talking about the B2C luxury products, Tiffany, Prada, or things like that, or are we talking about something else?
So business model applies to all types of businesses, so B2C of course, but B2B as well, business to business. And so there is just a little bit more complexity. I think those of us that are in a B2B type of business, we recognize that it's not just serving one customer. You have a lot of different stakeholders inside organizations. And so it's about understanding which stakeholders are the most important to serve, who are the most influential, and so understanding what value they get out from you in the process. So it's really about mapping all your stakeholders and defining what we call a value proposition for each one of these stakeholders.
And that's where you come in with your book, Value Proposition Design.
Exactly. So what we realize is that just looking at the business model canvas is great to give you the big picture view on innovation, but when you start diving deeper into what are customer problems, what value should they get out of this, the business model gets too messy, gets too crowded. So you have to zoom into two blocks of this business model canvas. This is essentially what the value proposition canvas is about. So you zoom into the customer segment, you understand what their problems, aspirations are, what we call jobs, pains, and gains. And then you understand what value you need to create for them so that they get their problem solved or get their aspirations met.
Okay, let's talk about value proposition now. The business world have understand the need to create value, not just sell products to a customer. Over the past maybe 10 years, 20 years, when you're doing your book, Value Proposition Design, where do you find that we do right and where do we find we've done wrong in terms of understanding value for customer?
Mm-hmm. So one thing, the holy grail of all of this is to get what we call product market fit. In other words, to understand what customers want, and then to be able to create something that matches that. So it's very easy to say, it's harder to get. It requires a lot of time and experimentation and trial and error. So what we see is that people tend to focus on looking at the world and looking at their customers through the lens of their products and services. And if you do that, you're just going to look at your customer as someone, as a potential buyer, but not someone who's trying to do something in their lives or in their work, whatever context you want to help them. And so the trick is to kind of shift that around and ask yourself, so there's this concept of jobs to be done, what jobs to be done? In other words, what motivations or what tasks do these customers need to do for which they might need your help through your products and services? But it's really about putting yourself in the shoes, in the experience of these customers, and really stopping looking at your products and services for a second.
So what can businesses now do to be able to sit on their customer's shoes? Apart from buying your books, obviously, that would be the ideal outcome for both of us. But what can businesses now do to sit at their customers' chairs and have a look at what their customer actually need?
Yeah, so I mean, at the conceptual level, there's this idea that you want to think about people hiring products and services in order to solve some of their problems and aspirations. And so if you think about that, it's not just about buying the right products, it's about hiring products in order to solve something that they want to solve. So that's already a mental shift. Now, to discover that in the real world, what you want to do is spend time with customers. And there's different techniques. We talk about them in the book, but essentially you can go out and ask questions, which is a great way to start. But very soon what you want to do is also understand or get a bit more of an unbiased view of what customers are about. So there are other techniques like observation, being a bit like an anthropologist, or co-creation with your customers, getting them to show you what they prioritize in the context where you want to help them. Another one is about taking the posture of a scientist. So you may have some assumptions about how you think you will create value for customers, but that's just assumptions. So you want to quickly throw out in the real world, in the context of where you might be able to help them, an experiment and see how they respond to their experiment, and let this evidence speak for itself and prove you right or wrong.
And how long do people typically, in your experience, do these kind of experiments?
Well, so there's different answers to that. I think what we see is that it is not a comfortable process for people in large organizations, because what we've been used to do in large organizations is maybe rely on third-party agencies to produce research reports and tell us what customers want, etc. The problem is, in this world that is moving so fast, what you want to try and get to an intimate understanding of what customers really want. And the only way to do that is for you to spend to spend that quality time with customers, to have a closer relationship with them. So, you want to try and do that process, which is the process that startuppers do quite well. And they do that quite well because they're forced. They don't have budget to hire research agencies to do the work for them.
This is startups, yeah.
Startups, yeah, exactly. Startups are doing this process well because they are constrained by the resources they have. They don't have a lot of time, they don't have a lot of money. So in other words, they have to go out there and meet the customers and really get a sense of what their customers are about. So the process can be quite quick. If you have, the right mindset, or if you have the right constraints. It could also take a lot of time if, you are used to another kind of process, which is more the process of, let's say, the 20th century.
Right. Okay, let's move on to feasibility, because a lot of time people find a very lucrative market, a very sizable market that they thought they can tap into, but after they look into the inside their organization, then they find that they cannot really tap into that market. So what kind of things that organizations can do to assess their feasibility before they make a move, they invest big?
Yeah, so feasibility is an interesting one. When what we see is that in 80% of the cases, you should not start with feasibility, you should actually start with desirability. In other words, proving that there is a market, that there is an interest out there, before worrying about how you're gonna, make your product, your fancy product or service happen. And the reason for that is you first need to really have a granular understanding of people's problems and aspiration. Because if you start with a particular idea, you go and check that you can do it, and then you bring it to your customers, inevitably you realize that's not exactly what they want. And then you've spent all this time trying to figure out how to do it. So you first want to try and prove that customers want it, then go to feasibility in most of the cases. And so then the process is really to look at what you have in your organization. And I think what's useful there is to look at your organization not in terms of what are the products and services, what are the tweaks that I can do, but looking at the fundamental assets, capabilities, knowledge that you have built over time. Every organization has that. But look at it from a fundamental asset, kind of a granular or component way, so that you can reorganize them in new ways to serve your customer. And often you will find that there is a lot of different spaces that you can be in, a lot of different ways that you can serve customers if you deconstruct kind of what you have built over time and try and reconstruct it in new ways. So I think that's an interesting approach to feasibility.
So I'm going to put you on the spot. If you found that you don't have the feasibility to tap into the market, is the answer is looking for a new market, a different market, or build up your capability so that market is feasible for your organization?
Yeah, so it's always it's a choice that depends on context, but I think what people think is, and then this is the tendency of going to feasibility, of saying, I'm not sure if we can do this, therefore we have to check everything, etc. But my experience of seeing different kind of clients and cases is that there is often a workaround in the world of feasibility, right? So if you have proven, if you have an understanding of what people want, maybe you cannot deliver it exactly the way you had it in mind, but maybe there is a workaround to be able to provide a different version of the value of the product or service that you had in mind. So often you don't need to change markets, you don't need to abandon the project, but you really want to try and be creative in terms of understanding where that apparent obstacle is leading to try and rethink about how you can serve your audience in better ways.
Right. That's good. So let's move into viability. I understand when I did my training with Strategyzer, we discuss numbers not as much as my experience in other business planning training.
Right.
So can you elaborate more about that? How important is numbers in the business model canvas?
Yeah, so they have a role, but what we like to say is let's go back to this idea of 20th versus 21st century, right? In the 20th century, I'm talking about 20th century because this was a world that was maybe less, dynamic, less changing, where you could have the same business model for a few decades and be fine.
100 years sometimes.
100 years for some industries, yeah. And so in those kind of situations, you would do a business plan. And then you would go and implement that business plan. And you would be very detailed about that business plans. It would be a 100-page long document, and you put everything in there, how many customers, how much they pay, what my product does, what regulation allows, etc. But in this world that we're in, and especially in this context of innovation, by definition, we don't have that knowledge at all. So to try and focus on a business plan, very detailed business plan, and focus on numbers would really be a lie, to ourselves. And it's really an obstacle. It's almost dangerous because you're creating the illusion of certainty when you don't have it, right? You don't have it. So it's about realizing that you don't have it and progressing through prototypes instead of, very fixed and detailed plans. So numbers have their role in the business model, but they have their role as well at the kind of prototyping level, meaning you want to do some very quick calculations about what a business model looks like, what the size of an opportunity looks like, without doing too much research, because this will keep shifting.
So we're not talking about massive spreadsheets.
Exactly. No massive spreadsheet at this stage. This comes later on when you've gotten some more validation that your idea exists or has legs in the real world. At the early stage of business model design, you just want to play with numbers, play with some assumptions around, is this the way we have imagined this business model? Is it viable? Is it gonna likely generate more revenue than cost? So that's just what you want to play with at the initial phase of the process.
Cool. So it sounds like we have the holy grail of business model, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it's the whole this whole space has given us a lot more possibility about what we can do as business people and beyond business people. I would say innovators in general. I think it's really interesting now. We have more powerful tools that allow us to do more powerful things. And one of the things that it allows us to do, I think, is to I think we see a lot of organizations now that are struggling a bit with change. And so with tools like this and the process that comes with it, I think you're able to navigate change in a more positive way. And what I mean by positive way is that you don't have to make a choice between serving my customers and polluting the planet, or just making money and not taking care of communities, etc. I think this tool and others give us the chance to create more, I would say, more wholesome businesses and innovations that allow us to, create the kind of innovations that ultimately people want in, this day and age.
So this is not the end of the story, and this is not the business model. There's still more to come, I suppose.
There's more to come, and personal interest of mine is to look at these organizations that are, pushing this space of business modeling further by creating innovations at the level of the business model. So, to go back to the very beginning of our conversation, that innovators that are able to innovate for customers, but also question the way that they organize themselves, how they work, how they acquire resources. And you see a lot of really interesting patterns nowadays across the world in terms of how this whole space of creating, delivering, and capturing value is evolving. And what's the beauty of it is that now, because we have tools like this, because we have a bit more of an understanding of what a business model is, we can also start copying patterns, right? So copying ideas. So it's not just about copying technology or a process or something. It's about copying the pattern of a business model from a particular player and bring it into our own space to try and play with that. It's not about copying 100%, but it's about drawing inspiration from that pattern to generate new possibilities for whatever we want to do.
Yeah, patterns are good. In fact, that's one of the things that attract me to use Strategyzer for my clients, because it's very easy to communicate patterns, not to copy exactly some most of the time, but to just give them ideas what's possible with certain patterns. So what's next for Strategyzer now?
So Strategyzer has 2 new books coming out. One is called Testing Business Ideas, coming out in November. And so the whole focus of this book will be to come out with a sense of, once you have designed a great value proposition or business model, what is the process of taking it out into the world and validating or invalidating the assumptions that you're making in your business model. And so there'll be a collection of testing techniques, how to use them with one another, and get through this process of validating your business model in the real world. So that's one book. Second book is called The Invincible Company, and it really builds on the whole, Strategyzer toolbox that's been developed over the last decade. And it's really taking people into this ultimate space of developing the capability of, reinventing business models as they are successful, not waiting for a crisis, not waiting to be acquired by someone, but really developing that capability inside the organization to keep reinventing the future. And part of that, will be introducing a new tool called the Portfolio Map, which is all about looking at the collections, the big picture of the organization, looking at the collection of business models and how to manage them together.
That's good. Awesome. It's been a really good time to have you in the podcast. Now, last question. How do people get in touch with you?
So people can get in touch with me through LinkedIn, and I'm happy for them to email me, and maybe we can leave my email on your page. Sure. Does that work like that?
Yep, it can. Thanks so much, Greg. Hopefully this will add a lot of value to the audience, and I'm looking forward to have you in another episode maybe next year.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed and find value from the discussion in this episode. Don't forget to leave some comment or write your review on iTunes. I'm really looking forward to hear what you think about this podcast. You can also leave your comment on my Facebook page, Biz Talk with Emmanuel. If you have any question about anything we discussed in this episode, feel free to send me a message using the button provided on the page. Until next time.